This is Dr. Huerta, and I will be talking about how people learn a first language and then how people learn a second language. So before we do that, we're going to start with an introduction with some terms and definitions. L1 refers to first language. L2 refers to second language. Language can be defined as a complex and dynamic system of conventional symbols used in various modes for communication and thought. So before we talk about how people learn a second language, it's important to understand first language learning theory and research. This is foundational to understand L2 learning and also how to teach a second language, or an L2. Every normal child learns an L1 successfully in a matter of a few years without formal lessons. So this is a clue into how people normally learn a second language. So you can think about, if you've ever learned a second language or tried to learn a second language, how this may have been the same or different from your first language learning process. And just as a side note, children who do not acquire an L1 or first language normally usually do not do so due to neurological and or extreme environmental factors. Linguists have noted a general pattern of development for first language, which can be helpful in understanding second language development. So let's look at this pattern of development. So if you see this slide on the left side, you have L1 language development. You can see that from birth, people generally have a perception of sound. They start discriminating language from non-language sounds. They produce crying. At 3 months, babies start cooing. At 6 months, in general, they start babbling. And then they lose the ability to discriminate non-native or non-L1 phonemes. Phonemes are the smallest units of sound in a language. So what's really fascinating here is that every person, when he or she is born, can actually hear and produce sounds that are present in all languages. So for example, we often talk about the R or R sound in Spanish, which is also present in a lot of other languages. Babies could actually perceive and make that sound. But by 6 months, they start getting used to the native language that they will be speaking, what they're hearing around them. By 9 months, they start producing their first words. It's pretty early. They have hollow phrases. Those are one-word phrases like mom or mommy, right, daddy. By 12 months, they use words to attract adults' attention, right? So like no. By 18 months, they have this vocabulary, just a spurt of growth in vocabulary learning. They start talking telegraphically, kind of like a telegraph, like me want water, I know like, things like that. By 24 months, they start making overgeneralizations. So, for example, that's when you apply grammatical rules incorrectly. For example, plurals are, for example, the rule is usually you add an S to make a plural. For example, a dog or dogs, cat or cats. So they might say deer, deers, right? Even though we know deer is singular or plural, but they're noticing rules in language. By and we're still on 24 months, and they can also respond to indirect questions. Okay, so some aspects of first language learning that are noted in second language development, this is the right-hand side of the slide, are the hollow phrases. So in the very earliest stages of second language learning, people will use single words to express a complete thought, usually a noun. So you might say water, or meaning I want water. So I know when I was trying to learn Mandarin, I learned how to say water, be like shui, but I might not know how to say I want water. That's a little more complicated, so I might just say shui and make some sort of gesture. There's also overgeneralizations. So like I said, explained earlier, it's error from trying to use a grammatical rule in context where it does not belong. So, here's a good one. So he goed instead of he went. Even though we know ed is a marker for past tense, but that's an irregular verb. Or foot, you say feet instead of foot. So that can happen in a second language. And here's a note. These characteristics or errors are normal and are evidence that the individual is making sense of English grammar rules. So let's talk about first language learning theories and what implications they have for teaching. So there's, if we go kind of back in time, B.F. Skinner, if you've ever heard of him in your psychology classes, perhaps. He's famous for the conditioning training, the dog with the bell, the dog hears the bell and knows it's time to eat. So that's behaviorist perspective. It's the idea that you can basically learn or train anyone or anything based on just behaviors like reward and punishment type of system. That's the most extreme version of behaviorism. So from here we get the idea that language is learned through imitation, through habit formation, and positive reinforcement. So again, you ring the bell, you feed the dog, so he'll come every time he hears the bell. It's also the idea that language teaching should provide models of correct language use and adult feedback and correction. Okay, so that's one theory that has influenced language learning, the behaviorist perspective of how people learn. There's also the innatist perspective. This comes from Noam Chomsky, who is extremely influential and still is in linguistic theory. So in this case, language is naturally acquired and individuals figure out language structure and grammar on their own. So this sounds a lot like naturalistic learning, right? How we learn a first language. So on this take, language teaching should provide many opportunities for authentic use of language without explicit adult correction, but rather just with modeling. So you're just modeling. You're not really correcting. Okay. Then you have the interactionist perspective. This comes from Lev Vygotsky, a famous Russian theorist and philosopher. Also, you've heard of Howard Gardner from Harvard University and his theories of multiple intelligences. So in this perspective, language learning is highly dependent on the environment and interaction between the learner, the child, and the expert, the adult. Language teaching should include many opportunities for interaction, and adults should modify their language to ensure that students understand what is being said. So these are all very strong perspectives based on theories, but I think that we can take a little bit from all of them to help us understand how to actually teach a language. So some things that first language theories have in common, the ones we just looked at. There's this idea of modeling language. Whether you're correcting or not correcting, there's always this idea of an expert being present. And then there's also the idea of interaction. It's not just a one-way thing. Even a baby has to hear language. Like I said, it's not normal for children to not learn a language. If they don't, it's extreme circumstances. And if it's not neurological, it's because they're not hearing language for whatever reason. So interaction is a part of it, part of the process of language learning. Also, the idea that there's a language structure that must be decoded is in all of these theories. All right, so let's transition. Theories of first language learning have greatly influenced theories of second language learning, research, and teaching methods, yet there are important differences between L1 and L2 learning and individuals.